So we are in Mark 14. Mark chapter 14. It's been 2 weeks since we've had our Mark class. And, as we've been saying since we turned the page to Mark 14, this is the part in the gospel account where all the focus shifts toward Jesus' crucifixion. And so the first section in this chapter, verses 1 through verse 11, focuses on sort of the reason why Jesus ended up becoming betrayed to the Jewish rulers. It clues us in on that incident that really pushed Judas over the edge and caused him to go and to make the deal with the Jewish rulers to betray Jesus. And now, in this the second section, we're going to notice the Last Supper. And, another way to look at this, we've got two dinners that are being highlighted here in these two sections. Chapter 14, verses 1 to 11, we've got the dinner. Mark doesn't identify in whose house it took place, but the dinner in Simon's house when Mary anointed Jesus to prepare him for his burial. And then now we're going to notice this dinner, which really serves as a foreshadowing of what's going to happen to Jesus, as Jesus is going to fulfill the type of the Passover lamb, and as Jesus institutes the Lord's Supper, which memorializes Jesus' death. All right, so Mark 14. Let's just, rather than just reading the whole section, let's just start in, and we'll go by verse for time, and just kind of make comments as we go. All right. So Mark 14, verse 12. On the first day of the festival of unleavened bread, when it was customary to sacrifice the Passover lamb, Jesus' disciples asked him, "Where do you want us to go and make preparations for you to eat the Passover?" All right, so the first day when the Passover lamb was sacrificed would be the 14th day of the first Jewish month. All right, so the Passover lambs, Jewish tradition tells us, were sacrificed between 3 and 5 p.m. that day. So this is earlier in the morning. And you remember they counted the day from 6 p.m. to 6 p.m. And obviously, they wouldn't make preparations between 6 p.m. and 6 a.m., so this would be the morning. So we're just a few hours away then from the time when the Passover lambs are going to be sacrificed. And so, the day of the week that we know this as would be Thursday. Now, Jesus is going to be crucified on Friday. He's going to be resurrected on Sunday. So this would be Thursday, all right? Now, if you're reading Matthew or Mark or Luke, you see this picture, that this is the day when the Passover lambs are sacrificed. However, if you're reading John's account, you might get the idea that there's a little bit of a contradiction. And let me show you what John says, and then we'll talk about a couple of ways that we can see that there's not a contradiction, but rather there's harmony between Mark and John. So turn over to John 13. John 13. Now, it's really, really interesting, and we've talked about some of these differences between what are called the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and then John. And, there's a lot of differences between the two. Not contradictions, but there's just a lot of differences between the two because, keep in mind, as John closes his gospel, many other things Jesus did in the presence of his disciples which aren't written in this book. If everything were written that Jesus did, the world couldn't contain the books. So all of these gospel writers are selective in what events in Jesus' life they tell us about and what details about those events that they tell us. You couldn't fill it all up. And in fact, in the book of Acts, just to illustrate the fact that Jesus said far more things in his teaching than what Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John record. Paul in the book of Acts, in Acts 20 verse 35, as he's speaking to the Ephesian elders, says that, even as our Lord showed us, it's better to give than to receive. Well, that's a saying of Jesus. And that's not found in any one of the gospel accounts. But Paul, obviously, as an apostle, knew that that was one of the sayings of Jesus that wasn't recorded, okay? But at any rate, okay, so in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, this Last Supper is the Passover, and we understand that during this Passover meal, Jesus institutes a new memorial supper for his people. We eat it every Sunday, called, the Lord's Supper. But in John's account, this meal, we're not told specifically what type of meal that it is, but what's highlighted in John's account at this meal is Jesus washing the disciples' feet. But it's the same meal. All of that happened at the same occasion. But notice how John begins chapter 13. Look at verse 1. It was just before the Passover. Your translation may say, as the NIV does, the Passover festival. Jesus knew that his hour had come for him to leave this world and to go to his Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end, etc., etc. So here we're told that it's before the Passover that this meal and the washing of the disciples' feet took place. And just to add to that a little bit more, turn over to chapter 18. Chapter 18 of John. And look at verse 28. Now this is Friday morning. Okay, so Jesus and the disciples, according to Matthew, Mark, and Luke, eat the Passover on what we would consider to be Thursday evening, Thursday night. Okay? So John chapter 18, this is Friday morning, early Friday morning, and we're told, John chapter 18, verse 28, then the Jewish leaders took Jesus from Caiaphas to the palace of the Roman governor. By now it was early Friday morning, and to avoid ceremonial uncleanness, they did not enter the palace because they wanted to be able to eat the Passover. So here, what's called the Passover hasn't been eaten yet. And so, people read that and they think, well, okay, Matthew, Mark, and Luke contradict John. But there are a couple of ways that people have suggested that this can be resolved. One way that people suggest that this can be resolved is to say, well, the Passover actually, on this occasion, was celebrated on 2 different days. 2 consecutive days. And you say, well, why would the Passover be celebrated on 2 consecutive days when everybody understood the Passover was to be celebrated on, the 14th day of the first Jewish month, in the evening? Why would it be celebrated on 2 consecutive days? Well, the suggestion has been made there might have been a disagreement among the Jewish leaders, the different groups of Jewish leaders, as to what day was the first day of the month. Occasionally, apparently, that happened. Because you understand, they follow a lunar calendar. So how do they identify the first day of the month? Well, they look for the new moon. And the thing about the new moon, it's no moon. And what if it were cloudy? And so there could have been a disagreement among Jewish leaders as to what day the first day of the month would fall on, what day was the new moon, because the Passover would be celebrated 14 days after the new moon. And of course, the Passover always took place when there was a full moon. So that's one way that people suggest that the harmony can be resolved. I don't personally find that to be the most persuasive, but that's one way. And by the way, I will say this. There were disagreements. We all recognize there's disagreements among the Pharisees and the Sadducees. There's lots of different disagreements between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, including how they calculate time relative to when they celebrate the various sacred festivals that the Old Testament mandates. And you read in Josephus about these differences. And the point is made that even though the Sadducees had the power, they controlled the temple, all the priests came from the Sadducees actually would typically give in to the Pharisees because the Pharisees were popular among the people. And if they went against the Pharisees, there would be, trouble among the rank and file people. So typically they would follow the Pharisees' opinion as to when to celebrate these feast days. So anyway, that just to illustrate the point that sometimes there were differences even on when they celebrate the festivals. All right, second way that we can find some harmony between Matthew, Mark, and Luke, their account of the Passover and the Last Supper, and John's account of the Passover and the Last Supper. And so it would just be simply this. You remember the first lesson we did on Mark 14, we pointed out that there were actually two festivals that took place at this time. Not one, but there were two. Okay, so just to illustrate this, let's just go back to Leviticus 23. I mean, we can notice this from a number of places, but go back to Leviticus 23. Leviticus 23, look at verse 4 beginning. Here we're told, "These are the Lord's appointed festivals, the sacred assemblies you are to proclaim at their appointed times." Now note verse 5. "The Lord's Passover begins at twilight on the 14th day of the first month." Now notice verse 6. "On the 15th day of the month, the Lord's festival of unleavened bread begins. For 7 days you must eat bread without yeast on the first," yada, yada, yada. Okay, so here you see there's the Passover on the 14th day, and then there's the festival of unleavened bread that begins the very next day. Okay? And you remember we noted that. You see that in Mark chapter 14, verse 1, a distinction made between the two. But here's the thing. Sometimes the festival of unleavened bread and Passover were just called by the same name. They were so closely associated, oftentimes they were just lumped in together. Okay? An example of that. Look at Luke chapter 22. Luke 22, verse 1. Luke 22, 1. "Now the festival of unleavened bread." Okay, what's the festival of unleavened bread? Is that the 14th day? Or is that the 15th through the 21st day? 15th through the 21st day. Yeah, according to Leviticus 23, that's the 15th through the 21st day. But notice what it's called. Luke 22, 1. "Now the festival of unleavened bread called the Passover was approaching." So, they just happen so close together that the festival of unleavened bread, which technically takes place after the Passover, is just called the Passover. And so I would suggest to you that that's what's going on in John. That John, whenever John says in John chapter 13, verse 1, "Now before the Passover festival," he's actually technically speaking of the festival of unleavened bread. And whenever he says, verse 28 of John 18, "Now the Jewish leaders, etc., to avoid ceremonial uncleanness, they did not enter the palace because they wanted to be able to eat the Passover," what's talking about there is the continuing ceremonial eating of unleavened bread that would last from the 15th through the 21st day. And you think, okay, and I saw your hand go up. Let me finish this one thought. You think, why would John do that? Why would John speak in that way? Why would John not even mention Jesus and the disciples eating the Passover? And here is a suggestion as to why. John does it to try to make explicit that Jesus is the Passover lamb. Because in John's gospel account, just from the way that just it appears, just a superficial reading, not going down deep, from John's gospel account, what time is it that Jesus dies on the cross? 3 p.m. What is the time that the Jewish rulers are sacrificing the Passover lambs at the temple? 3 to 5. And how does John picture Jesus in the very first chapter? Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. And so I think that's what John is doing. You know, John is not contradicting the gospel accounts, but he's making the typology explicit just in the way that he presents it. And so I don't think that there is a contradiction between the synoptic gospel accounts and John. Todd? Right? Yeah, that was to take place from the 14th day on through the 21st day. Yep. Yep. Yes, ma'am. Oh, that's literally the text says between the evenings. Okay, so there actually was a debate among the Jews, and if you read commentaries now, you see lots of different opinions. So one group believed that twilight was it was a short period of time from when the sun sets until the sun fully goes down. That's twilight, between the evenings. But what was actually practiced at the temple in Jesus' day was between the evenings was between 3 p.m. and 5 p.m. Because remember, the Jewish day ended at 6 p.m. So that's how it was interpreted in Jesus' day. Other thoughts, comments, questions?
So it's not dark between 3 and 5?
No, it's not.
Unless they were, must be.
Yeah, I mean that's in spring. You know, you're April, so it wouldn't be. No, they weren't that dumb. So, anyway. So I guess I gave my just keep the time the change. What am I? I'm not even making sense. Keep the time the same. I don't care what it is. Just keep the time the same. Okay, so nothing more about John's relationship then. All right, let's go back to Mark. So notice Mark 14:12 again. On the first day of the festival of unleavened bread, when it was customary to sacrifice the Passover lamb, Jesus' disciples asked him, "Where do you want us to go and make preparations for you to eat the Passover?" So in what's going to follow, he's going to give them instructions as to how to find the room where the Passover was to be eaten. So, a couple of things about that, and then we'll talk about what all they would have to do to make preparations. So, we've said before that Jerusalem was full. It was overflowing at this particular point in time because you've got, Jews who have come from all over the world to celebrate the Passover festival. I mean, you remember on the day of Pentecost? Look over at Acts chapter 2. I don't know if we did this whenever we talked about this before, but look at Acts 2. Acts 2, let's start in verse 5. Remember, the apostles have been baptized in the Holy Spirit, and they start, speaking in languages, glorifying God that they've never learned. And Acts 2:5 says, "Now there were staying in Jerusalem God-fearing Jews from every nation under heaven." Now why? Well, because it's Pentecost. It's one of the pilgrim festivals. And so verse 6, when they heard this sound, a crowd came together in bewilderment because each of them heard their own language being spoken. Utterly amazed, they asked, "Aren't all these who are speaking Galileans? And, so they're not noted for their education. That's the point. Another way to say it would be, aren't these who are speaking rednecks? They just haven't learned multiple languages. Verse 8. Then how is it that each of us hears them in our own native language? So here's where Jews have come from for this festival. Parthians, Medes and Elamites, residents of Mesopotamia, Judea and Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt and the parts of Libya near Cyrene, visitors from Rome, both Jews and converts to Judaism, Cretans and Arabs, we hear them declaring the wonders of God in our own tongues. So that's the group that you have in Jerusalem. Okay, so Josephus said that Jerusalem's population during Passover reached nearly 3 million. Now, it's typically thought that Josephus was exaggerating, because the way that that's arrived at is, I won't tell how that's arrived at. Not needed. Anyway, nearly 3 million. So everybody thinks that Josephus is exaggerating. So a more recent scholar who has written a pretty well-respected book on the city of Jerusalem and its history and customs and all of that, he estimated that it's more like 180,000, which, to us doesn't seem like that many people, but when you think about the fact that it's not a modern city, it's an ancient city with walls, narrow streets, its acreage wouldn't be equivalent to that of a modern city, Yeah, and the average population in Jerusalem was generally thought to be about 30,000 in Jesus' day. So you take all that into account, 180,000, that's quite a crowd. So it was enough that, Jesus and his disciples, they weren't staying in Jerusalem during the week. They're over in Bethany on the Mount of Olives because it's hard to find a place. But by Jewish law, the Passover had to be celebrated inside the walls of Jerusalem. So now Jesus is going to send his disciples to find a room for them all to eat the Passover. And, by Jewish law, and, you see hints of this like in Exodus 12, the group that would eat the Passover couldn't be smaller than 10. So, of course, you understand that Jesus and his disciples, who numbered 12, they would be a group large enough. So what all would Jesus' disciples have to prepare? Well, they'd have to prepare the lamb. They'd have to find the lamb. Now, actually, we think of it being a lamb. It could be a lamb or it could be a goat. And you don't hear this much, but, and I don't know that it was practiced all that much. There's some indication that it wasn't in some of the Jewish traditional literature. But Deuteronomy 16, it could even be a bull. I mean, you don't think of that, but it could come from the cattle as well. So an animal from any one of those three, which, again, it probably wasn't, a bull or a calf. But at any rate, they'd have to get the Passover lamb, and then they would have to get the bitter herbs that were eaten. In the Old Testament, Exodus 12. Bitter herbs had to be eaten to symbolize the bitterness of Israel's, bondage to the Egyptians. And then they would have to get the materials in order to make the traditional, the lack of a better word, the dipping sauce, which would be made out of kind of a fruit puree, and there would be some nuts and that sort of thing, and they would dip their bread. They'd have to get some unleavened bread, which this time of year would probably be barley bread because that's what was being harvested at the time. So they'd get their unleavened barley bread and they would, get some lamb with it and they would dip that in the sauce. So they'd have to make all this preparation. And so, I'll say a word about the slaughter of the sacrifice of the Passover lamb. So, Jewish traditional literature tells us that all the priests had to work together because there's so many sacrifices that have to be offered in such a short time. And so the worshipers who were there who needed to have their animal sacrifice, they would be admitted into the temple court, which remember Herod's temple had multiple courts, but they would be admitted into the court of the Israelites, all right, which was not the biggest court. It's one of the more inner courts. And they would be admitted in there in 3 groups successively, okay? And you would have all these priests who are lined up. They would be in 2 groups lined up. And the priests in one row would have gold bowls, and the priests in the other row would have silver bowls. And so they would be lined up from where the people start all the way back to the altar. And so the worshipers would come and they would, actually slit the throat of the animal. And the priests would be standing there, and in the bowls they would catch the blood of the animal that had been sacrificed. And then they would just be passing it down the line. There would just be this constant passing of the bowls down the line, and the last priest next to the altar would splash it against the altar, and then the bowls would be passed back down. And it would just be one worshiper after another slaughtering the animals, and the priest collecting the bowl and just passing the bowls down the line and splashing against the altar, because the blood had to be splashed against the altar. And then, while all that's going on, they would go out and there were hooks around the court. And so they would hang their lambs and their goats up on those hooks, and they would open it up and they would remove the fat and the organs, and there would be priests there to collect those, because that, they couldn't eat. That had to be burned on the altar. And so after that, after you went through the 3 successive groups of the Israelites doing that, then they would take their animals that, they've bled out and they've removed the fat and all of that. They would take their animals out somewhere else in the city, and then they would roast their animals. So, all that had to be done, pretty quickly, 3 to 5, and then they would take it back to whatever house or room it was that they were eating the Passover, and go through all of that ritual. So, yes, sir.
I was going to say, in this instance, it Jesus had a reservation.
Oh, that may be.
I mean, it seemed like either he knew somebody and already stepped this, because it says that they went and everything was prepared.
Well, yeah, but people living in Jerusalem would prepare, because they know pilgrim festivals are, pilgrims, are present. So that would just be the natural thing. So I don't know if there was a prearrangement, or if this is an example of Jesus' miraculous foreknowledge that would be used then to cause the disciples to think, oh, hey, yeah, there is something special about this guy. So I don't know. You find more. It depends on the commentator. Those that maybe are less conservative and more trying to find naturalistic explanations, they say, well, Jesus already had the arrangement. Those that are stronger on Jesus' divinity opt for that second, that this is Jesus' foreknowledge. Yeah. So.
Concerned if he was one or the other.
Oh yeah. Sure.
It could be either or both.
Right. Sure. Okay. 2 hands. I think Jim was first, and then Todd. Or.
Use your numbers, then 18,000 of those acts had,
Oh yeah, at least. Yeah. If it's 180,000 and at least 10, groups no smaller than 10. So yeah, possibly 18,000. Yep. Yes, sir.
I think it was more miraculous the way it's worded there than it was prearranged, because he would have said go to Joseph's house or whoever's house at this address or whatever. It wouldn't have said go look for a guy with a jar on his head.
Yeah. Maybe. Yeah, maybe.
God was in control.
So look at verse 13. Did somebody else have their hand up? I wasn't sure, did I? No, okay. So look at verse 13. So Jesus sent 2 of his disciples, telling them, go into the city, and a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him. All right, so Matthew and Mark don't tell us who those 2 disciples were. But Luke tells us who those 2 disciples were. Look at Luke chapter 22. Luke 22, look at verse 8. Jesus sent Peter and John saying, "Go and make preparations for us to eat the Passover." So, why would Mark not tell us Peter and John? Well, there's no way to be sure, but here's one possibility. The traditional thought is that, Mark's inspired, but the source of Mark's information for the gospel was Peter. That's been the tradition in the church from very early on. And so, there are some instances when it seems like, if that's true, if Peter was the source of Mark's information, that you see a little bit of Mark's modesty, or a little bit of Peter's modesty in leaving his name out or reporting some negative things about Peter, etc. All right, so the two disciples are Peter and John. Now, Jesus says, when you go into the city, a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Well, you think about it. Okay, so if Jerusalem is just jam-packed with people, and if it's jam-packed with people who are making preparations for the Passover, this meal that they're going to eat, and, obviously they're going to have water. I mean, surely there would be lots of men carrying jars of water making preparation. Well, not so fast. Keep in mind that, it's traditionally thought that gathering water was not a man's job, it's a woman's job. I guess in an egalitarian society like, we're in more and more, you don't think of, it's not politically correct to talk about man's work and woman's work. But, they weren't quite as politically correct as we were, and, they followed more traditional roles. And so it's typically the case that women were the ones who collected the water. Look at two passages where we see that. Let's look at one in the Old Testament and one in the New Testament. Look at Genesis 24. Genesis 24. So Abraham's trying to marry Isaac off. And so, he doesn't want Isaac to marry a Canaanite woman. And so he sends his servant back to Padan Aram to get a wife from his own people for Isaac. And so the servant arrives, and Genesis 24:11 says this: "The servant had the camels kneel down near the well outside the town. It was toward evening, the time the women go out to draw water." Now look at John 4. John 4. Jesus is traveling from Judea to Galilee, and he goes through this village in Samaria, and he's tired, so it's noon. He sits down. The disciples go into the village to get food, but Jesus is sitting by the well. And John chapter 4 and verse... wrong chapter. I was in chapter 5. John 4, look at verse 7. We're told, when a Samaritan woman came to draw water, Jesus said, "Will you give me a drink?" So here again, you just see this tradition that it's the women that go out to draw the water. It's the women who are carrying the jars of water from the well. But here, Jesus says, you're going to meet a man who's carrying a jar of water. So he's going to stick out. There's something unique about him. And Jesus says, whenever you see that guy, you follow him. All right, back to Mark 14. Look at verse 14. "Say to the owner of the house, he enters." The teacher asks, "Where is my guest room, where I may eat the Passover with my disciples?" So, anybody that had an extra room in Jerusalem at this time would make that available for the pilgrims who've come. And by the way, I guess this might be a decent place to say this. Whenever it says, "Where is my guest room?" the word that's used there for guest room, that's the word that you find in Luke 2. Whenever we're told that Joseph and Mary went to Bethlehem in order to be enrolled in the census, and there was no room for them in the blank. So, of course, they were out in the stables, and Jesus was born in the stables, and, he was laid in the manger. And we talk about there was no room for them in the blank. Well, usually, blank. I'll explain here in a second. There was no room for them in the blank. Usually we fill in the blank with the word in. There's no room for them in the inn. And, we think of Joseph and Mary going to the local, Motel 6, and you've got that mean, motel clerk who, says, "Can't you see the no vacancy sign flashing?" And, there's no room for you here in this motel. Well, that is not the Greek word for motel. It's this word. Actually, whenever you find, the word for motel or inn, in Luke's gospel account in Luke 10, it's a different Greek word, and it's found relative to the Samaritan, who finds the man beaten and left half dead on the road between Jerusalem and Jericho, and he takes him on into the town, and he takes him into the inn. It's a different Greek word. So it's probably not a motel, it's not an inn, but rather it's a guest room. The guest room where they were going to stay was already filled up. And so then they go, that's a minor point, but just for the sake of accuracy, it was not a mean motel owner that would not let Joseph and Mary stay there. All right, so anyway, you get to the house, you say to the owner of the house, "Where's my guest room where I and my disciples can eat the Passover?" Verse 15, "And he'll show you a large room upstairs, furnished and ready." Right? And so a part of the furnishings that would make it ready would be the water that this man that they followed has been carrying. They would need water. So there Jesus said, "Make preparations for us." All right. And by the way, whenever Jesus washed the disciples' feet, in John chapter 13, and, he took off his outer garment, wrapped a towel around him, and he takes, a bowl of water and he starts washing the disciples' feet. Some of the water that Jesus used to wash the disciples' feet was the water that this man was carrying, in all probability, because that's a part of the furnishings that made the room ready. All right. Yes, sir.
It says in 14 where he goes in and say to the master of the house.
That'd be the owner of the house.
So the guy carrying the water
Might have been a servant.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking.
Yep.
If it's a woman's.
Or it could have been a son. It could be.
Maybe he didn't have a wife.
Yeah, maybe. Maybe so. Any other comments or questions? Yeah, it could be. There's 180,000 people, so it could be a lot of different people. Sam? Yes.
That's not biblical.
Well, so you see an evolution of the Passover even in the Bible, from the initial celebration in Egypt to the recurring yearly celebration that is commanded like in Deuteronomy 16. There's some changes. So in Exodus 12, it's a home celebration. But by the time you get to Deuteronomy 16, it's a celebration that involves a sacrifice at the tabernacle. So look at Deuteronomy 16. Deuteronomy 16, let's start in verse 1. Observe the month Aviv, which is just their first month, corresponds with our March, April. Observe the month Aviv. Your translation may say Abib. It's just how you transliterate the Hebrew letter. And celebrate the Passover of the Lord your God, because in the month of he brought you out of Egypt by night. Now notice verse 2. Sacrifice as the Passover to the Lord your God an animal from your flock. So again, that could be a lamb, or that could be a goat, or herd. So again, that could be a calf. At the place the Lord will choose as a dwelling for his name. So there's where it moves to the tabernacle and later the temple. Yes, sir.
Okay, so another one that, well, that seems to bring up, I mean, you said the beginning of their year or the end of the year is our March, April.
So this, their first month. Now, it depends on how you view it, right? So
The beginning of their year right now.
So it depends on how it's viewed, right? So here, Aviv is their first month. Now that corresponds to roughly our March 25th to April 25th. That's thereabouts. That's how you view it. But in another way of reckoning it, what's their seventh month is also considered to be their New Year celebration. So that would be more your September, October, okay? And that's when the beginning, the first day of the seventh month is what's often considered to be the beginning of their civil year, and then Aviv, so March, April, is considered to be the first month of their religious calendar. So it's just how you reckon it. Yeah. But technically, biblically, this would be their seventh month. I mean, I don't know what the Day of Atonement is this year, what day Yom Kippur is this year. Okay. Whenever Yom Kippur takes place, that's the 10th day of their seventh Jewish month. And then they've got the Festival of Booths that would take place the 15th through the 22nd day of that month. But their civil New Year would be the first day of the seventh month. Okay, and that's September, October.
The Jewish New Year is what's happening now.
And if you view it from the civil standpoint, yes. From the religious standpoint, their first month is March, April.
But there's some religious festival, I'll listen to.
Yeah, so the seventh month, the religious festivals, you've got the New Year's, the first day, you've got Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, the 10th day, and then you've got the Festival of Booths, the 15th to the 22nd day. Yep. So, and that's the final pilgrim festival of the year, the festival in gathering. So the summer fruits are brought in biblically and offered to the Lord during the festival of booths.
And this is the Day of Atonement.
No, that's the Day of Atonement is the 10th day of the seventh month, and the festival of booths is the 15th through the 22nd day. Yeah, and you read about these like Deuteronomy 16, verses 13 and following, the Festival of Tabernacles. That's the festival that will occur now. You see it also in Leviticus 23, where we turned. See all that stuff.
But their New Year, that's the New Year on you said silver.
Well, so biblically, just speaking biblically, okay, that is never called the New Year.
Okay.
Biblically. So in the Bible, it's the religious calendar, and by the religious calendar, the first month is March, April. Yep. Sure. Everybody thoroughly confused. What? Oh, or is it? Oh, yep. Okay. What's that?
I'm just thankful we're under a new law.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Would you? We'll pick up here next week, Lord willing.